Good afternoon. My name is Papa Omotayo, and it's really good to be here chatting as part of the Rise Festival. I'm the founder of an organization and creative director called MOE Plus Art Architecture, which are based in Lagos, Nigeria. A little bit of background about the type of work that we do. And that work is really focused around urban intervention, architecture, and cultural production. So our work sort of looks at the city at a wide scale, but then is really interested in sort of like cultural programming in terms of activations. So we do a lot of work within the artistic community, creating artistic spaces, but also like programming, like the image on the bottom right-hand corner, which is Tuan Street Art Festival, which is sort of a project and a program that came about around the old historical area of Lagos Island. And for us, for me, it's really important the context of where our work occurs predominantly, which is in Lagos. And even within Lagos, most of our work is within a particular area of Lagos, which is Lagos Island. And in working in Lagos Island, or rather working in the wider context of Nigeria, and working in public space and in cultural programming, one of the things that sort of comes up and up over and over again is how we're thinking about materiality within the context of design and the wider public realm. And that's really what we're kind of here to discuss today, which is connecting a conversation around the city of Lagos, public space, and also materiality. And we're really going to take along three themes, which is about Lagos and its growth and consumption, and how that sort of ties in with what we kind of see as a foundation of Lagos, which is a city that is really about public realm, maybe not in the traditional sense, but the public realm and the citizens are really sort of permeate visibly in all aspects of the city. And then the other thing is sort of thinking about materiality. So for me, Raul Matura in his book Kinetic City really, I think, sort of summed up Lagos as this ingenious and indigenous urbanism that is has its own particular local logic. It's not necessarily the city of the poor, as most images might suggest. Rather, it's a temporal articulation and occupation of space to not only create richer sensibilities of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in dense urban conditions. And I think when we're thinking about a city like Lagos and how it's growing at such a fast rate, when we think about the city in terms of its population and how that's growing and the age range of that population, and the question is always like, what is the material of this growth for us, and how we're thinking about that when addressing issues of space, even before formal architecture, just in terms of the public realm. And I think for the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of intense interrogation and thought about the city. And some of it is mixed with dread, and some of it's mixed with awe. And as each new investigation to the city to try and understand its inherent complexities, and how the sort of citizens and its inhabitants cohabit, this sort of distorted urban and rural life, and live within the certain, I guess, defined and undefined uncertainty and what we call like scarcity of the functions of daily life. And that runs right across in terms of economic uncertainty, infrastructural uncertainty, material uncertainty. And yet somehow within these constraints, you know, the city seems to be constantly, and the individuals within it seem to be constantly striving for new paths And this idea of this new idea is always around the corner, this new sensibility and this new opportunity, something that is sort of the lifeblood. And I think it's a general understanding of the city. When people think about Lagos, they think about it as sort of a dynamic place that is sort of moving towards a sense of personal glory and transcendence. And you feel that in the individuals, but you also feel that in how the city is sort of formed. But I think, you know, it's always important to sort of bring a level of reality back into thinking about the city. And as we think about theories and we visualize new visions of the city, whether those through like images of Echo Atlantic or, you know, Brave New Worlds, for the average citizen, you know, it's a city and a place of necessity and sustenance. It's a hard place. It can be unrelenting and unforgiving. And it's exhausting, and there are very minimal places for leisure. And I think one of the things we're constantly trying to address is this, like the need for these designated real spaces for common and public relief, which is kind of hard to find in the city. And when we think about the city and we think about the population that is expected to nearly double by 2015, and this demand for this growth is sort of a demand for buildings, a demand for infrastructure, and there's a demand for materiality. Whether we're thinking about, you know, the need for affordable housing, or as we've been discussing and how we're looking at the city from a space of urban intervention, there is a need for materiality for that. And there's a need to sort of think about the innovation of material optionality, you know, partly because when we think about consumption in Nigeria and Lagos, the majority of that consumption is imported. And when we think about consumption and we think about growing cities like Lagos with this, you know, the GDP or the amount of consumption that is required and needed, materiality sort of plays a central part for that. You know, I think the previous image is kind of how I always think about the city as a sort of rebellious teenager, you know, and this parent that is Nigeria trying to sort of formalize the city, but somehow, you know, the teenager is really kind of saying, these are the things that I want. And an example of that is, you know, when we think about something in the city like you know, as you saw the city growing, the consumer growing, and the need for better structures in terms of land acquisition. The 1978 Land Act, which was sort of created to sort of help think about ownership of land to the state in the hope that the state was going to be able to use it to create better equity for all. But again, as we kind of think about the city, we know that, you know, subsequent governments have sort of not been able to do that. And now land is really seen as an opportunity for sort of social segregation, which has kind of become more and more problematic. And when we think about how the city is growing, I think one of the things we need to really think about is what that growth means, and how we need to rethink about the urban form of what that city could be, not from a place of, you know, as a point of input rather, not as an outcome of development, and how we need to really integrate that relationship between the rural and urban economies, because as we know, migration into the city on a daily basis is huge. And also really consider how this green economy and material efficiency and sort of this resource scarcity feeds into that. You know, one of the things, you know, we speak about time and time again in our practice is this sort of scarcity of materiality and scarcity of resources that are sort of form an existing architectural language in the city, but somehow there hasn't been a formation of that. One of the things that is always clear in Lagos is it's how you use materials. Not only has to think about efficiency, but also has to think about them as a point of scarcity. You know, there's something that you want to use today may not be available tomorrow. And when you think about the design process and how design thinks about procurement and this idea of resources and materials always being available. And in a city like Lagos, it's constantly battling with that. So you have some of this sort of like hodgepodge approach to materiality, where things are unfinished and left later for something else to kind of be incorporated in it. And this is sort of a language of architecture that I think speaks to some of the challenges when we think about the green economy in a longer scale, and what cities that are sort of experiencing these massive growth will have to deal with. And there always seems to be this conflict as to like what growth is. And I think it's important to understand before we get into thinking about formal spaces as the city grows is, growth is inevitable, it's desirable. But I think what we're speaking about, rather what we're trying to engage with, is what that character of that growth looks like. And the question is always for us, how do we think about that when we're thinking about cities like Lagos and other cities, when we apply these realities of economies of scales, availability of resources, and how that in fact could help inform new languages for architectures and the city as a whole. And I think for us, these new radical ideas in redefining how the spaces in the cities will imagine themselves kind of in turn reconnect the ambitions of the city to the citizenry in a real tangible sense. Therefore, when we speak of the progress of new roads, infrastructure, architecture that makes Lagos feel, and I guess in minuscule segments like London, Cape Town, New York, with the new bridges, internet connectivity, and so forth. And there are huge improvements in the city's desire to appropriate new technical opportunities towards creating more robust infrastructure and better transportation, security, and other things to sort of allow the city to grow. There is a sort of contradictory, unfinished city that continues to remain. And I think critical to that is in terms of how the citizenry thinks about materials, but also in terms of the availability of materialities. And I think when you think about cities as a whole, traditionally, there's never been an idea that cities need to be thought about in terms of material scarcity. It's you think about new cities like Dubai, Singapore, or new extensions to places like London and New York. These cities look like there is no consideration to materials being scarce. And I think that's the difference here in Lagos. So I think, if we think of Lagos as a sort of post-colonial type of new city, an unfinished city could be an option we could look at here. And I think the idea of incomplete in this context is not so much like a failed city, but a city that sort of allows for more active negotiation and participation, not just in how it grows, but in the opportunities for the spaces it's able to create, and more important within that, the materiality of those spaces. So when we look at the language of Lagos as is on the left in this image that sort of is taken in Lagos mainland, around the back of an old part of Lagos called Yaba. And then we look on the right, which is sort of the footprint of the sort of new Eco-Atlantic development, which is the idea of re-envisioning Lagos more in vein with Dubai and so forth. It's really a question about where the value lies in these two opportunities, because one feels like a spaces that are sort of engaged on a daily understanding of what it means to have a city that is participatory and negotiated, and the other feels sort of like the unreality of the reality, where a city that can be created regardless of the reality of the citizenry or the opportunities or the limitations of economic growth and material availability. So I think when we think about urban interventions and when we think about the city growing. For us, it's really about how do we use all of these things to kind of create a sense of commons. And one of the things we're always sort of speaking to is how public interactions and re-engaging like the citizenry into this sort of approach to collective reimagination of their environment. And one of the ways we kind of aim to do that is speaking about this idea of a city as self-regulating attitude that feels localized and sort of resisting abrupt formal interventions, which have sort of occurred to date. And even in Lagos now, the reality is even in 2021, the city is mostly forged out of sort of pockets of self-regularized, as the city's inhabitants sort of view the state as absent and the city for theirs to sort of repurpose at will. And I think one of the things that people fail to understand when they think about Lagos as a city and Lagos as its growth, I think Lagos is one of the few cities in the world that constantly asks questions devoid of sentimentality. You know, there are always clashes where, you know, there is an approach to always be like, oh, we need the city to be frozen and look like this. And the question the city always seems to ask is like, why? You know, we need to sort of keep this historic building that was part of our colonial history, you know, but the community are like, well, we don't want to, we want to take it down. And again, it's, you know, these questions that perhaps normally the state would take ownership of and dictate, because there is so much self-regulation in so many areas of the city. There seems a sense that, you know, the city is in a space now that it needs to sort of work with the local citizenry at a greater level than I think the state would like it to. So I think one of the things that obviously when we're talking about growth in the city, as we move from this idea of growth to how it affects the creation of or the interactions within the public realm, is thinking about the material consumption and how that sort of leads to waste, and how within that material consumption, like I've spoken earlier, there is a sort of lack of access, and that sort of access brings scarcity. And I think one of the things we've been trying to understand is how we can find new spaces or new opportunities to sort of link all of these things together. And in the last few years, we've been looking at the materiality, not just within our own projects, but also in the public realm, and how we need to think about waste on the one hand as a new material library within the city in a very real and tangible sense, because what is clear is that new materials, you know, and the scarcity of new materials limits the opportunities there. But again, waste, as in everything, occurs throughout the city and across any aspect of growth and consumption. And I think when we think about material scarcity and using waste to sort of redefine architecture in our public realm, I think it allows us to sort of think about these three elements of sort of society, the natural environment, and the economy, and where these things come together, that allows for things that are viable, equitable, and ultimately find a space of sustainability, both in terms of the growth and in terms of materiality, but also in terms of the interactions between, you know, all the different elements that form the activation of space within cities. And in doing that, we've sort of working on the last few years, supported by the Development Bank of Nigeria, to start investigating what we've termed at the moment is the material lab. And again, like I said, this thing just started thinking about how growth is led by consumption and how consumption produces waste. but at the same time, growth needs access to materials and finding the intersection between all of these spaces. And obviously that waste is food consumption, materials used in the construction industry, and so forth and so forth. And finding how we can think about new access to materials from a point of view of naturally occurring waste that are used, and also material waste that has gone through initial use, whether that's through the built industry, etc. Obviously, there's a growing engagement with plastics, both here in Nigeria and the wider global world, and how that is starting to translate into new forms of material use. Again, it's like, how do you take some of these things and sort of localize them? And one of the things we see as a first form of access is in the public realm, because I think that offers an opportunity for a wider engagement in the commons outside of, I guess, more prestige projects. Because I think once you create some sort of local know-how of that already exists in terms of how materials are thought about, but then add another layer for new options for materials from waste within local communities, it sort of helps broaden the scope. And as I've mentioned about, what the scarcity does is allow for fluctuation, and fluctuation allows for uncertainty, and uncertainty, as we know, sort of has wider effects on the opportunities for better equity. So in collaboration with an organization called ADAPT, we've been sort of looking at how we sort of create new narratives and also map existing material landscapes. So as I mentioned, in Nigeria, 2014, this is the last real census that was had on the material consumption rate. It's gone up significantly since that. And obviously in the construction industry here, concrete is a major player in the urban infrastructural landscape. But at the same time, Nigeria is generating almost 32 to 400 billion tons of solid waste as of 2012, and that is gone up exponentially, as we've said, as growth is and consumption is becoming more and more required. So I think what the function of the idea was, if a material lab could create a starting point for investigation into the materiality of our environment, to sort of build a local archive of sustainable and waste materials which are able to consolidate the current language of repurpose and reuse. As I've mentioned, due to the nature of how the existing systems of access has been, the language, or rather the means to sort of repurpose and reuse, already exist at regional level. But again, for us, it's really like, how do we map that more formally and make that knowledge and opportunities even clearer? Are creating a sustainable approach to growth that will inform ultimately architecture and design. To the next page. So I think what we're saying is actually uncertainty and scarcity is not necessarily a negative thing, because it can lead us to sort of new paradigms. And I think when we think about the material lab as an opportunity in conjunction with these new paradigms, when it creates new access, and new access creates new opportunity and allows, hopefully in the longer term, a city that is growing with better equity. And right now our focus is on Lagos, but the project aims to sort of take other cities, major cities in Nigeria, to sort of take the same approach, where we're looking at the size, we're looking at the amount of waste that's being looked at, we're looking at the urban design of those main public spaces and urban design, and we're looking at how those cities have growth. and what's being consumed in those cities, and trying to find a way to interconnect all of these things to sort of create a material library and archive for each of these cities in the long term. So, so really, at the moment, what we've really been doing is collecting regional data, and the aim is that regional data across the material landscapes of each of those cities, both in mapping where materials are sourced from, where materials are brought in from, the type of materials that they use, and then finding ways to sort of redefine the narrative of material use and the optionality of material use in new tangible ways that still allow for these opportunities for growth, but perhaps can allow for how we think about materials in these cities in different ways. So in Lagos, for instance, we're thinking about, industry products, food, beverages, chemicals, huge amount of use of steel, metal products, and paper, as well as electrical textiles. Lagos obviously is the highest consuming city in the whole of Nigeria, perhaps in Africa as a whole. And then we're looking at existing construction materials that are used. So whether that's from existing mud and stabilized earth construction to the massive use of sandcrete cement blocks, as well as other things like iron, zinc, and aluminum materials, and how we kind of map those things and figure out how they can be sort of integrated into this material library. And also looking at more organic waste that naturally occurs throughout the cities, whether we're looking at hyacinth in the waterways that are seasonal, and looking at how that can be reintegrated into the material landscape of the city from a development point of view, and taking a more collaborative approach, both in terms of how it's traditionally been used and other ways that it could be used. And the same when we're thinking about existing sawmill, things like sawdust and other waste products that are sort of already being created seasonally as a part of the existing industries. And really just kind of reconnecting the language between the production and consumption cycle, and putting waste into the process, not to sort of take it out, but find a way to sort of reintegrate it back into the production and consumption process. And so some of these are sort of our initial, I guess, the ongoing investigations and sort of visual mapping. I think critical for us in this project is also to create documentation that is engaging, as well as it is informative. And also to just kind of now think about how that feeds back into impact. So when we're looking at this kind of language of the city that I've discussed, this sort of incompleteness, this approach, or rather this new material library could perhaps come back to feed back into it, and build new bridges that speaks to a more sustainable sort of growth along the lines of the city's urban and physical development, and perhaps extend beyond that outside of Nigeria, for instance. So when we think about this image from Lekan Jaifus and his Lagos Megacities project, you get the sense of this sort of integration of the sort of reuse element that could form new narratives in architecture and the wider urban landscape. That's it. Thank you very much. Look forward to having a chat and some questions. There are a lot of themes going on there, and I just touched on a couple of things. But I think for us, it's really, we never try and just think about work that is purely architectural or purely urban. I think for us, it's always to think about it from a point of view of how do we always think about design from the initial point of view where more architecture is only because people want to consume more, you know, and that has to tie into, you know, issues of resource scarcity and how resources need to be thought about from the initial stage. So when we're thinking about design, or when we're thinking about urban interventions, we're really thinking about materials as a reality of like resource, both in terms of their imprint, in terms of their scarcity, but also their overall damage on the wider environment. So that's what really speaks to sustainability to us. So it would be great to have a chat after this. I look forward to hearing some questions.